late afternoon, May 29, 1944. Somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, roughly 500 miles west of the Azores Islands, a German submarine commander named Detlev Krankenhagen ordered his vessel down to 600 feet beneath the ocean surface. He commanded a Type 9 C-40 submarine, one of the larger German boats, and less than an hour earlier, his crew had successfully torpedoed an American escort carrier. Now the hunters had reversed roles. Through the underwater listening equipment, Krankenhagen and his men could hear the propellers of American warships circling above them, searching methodically. The sound was relentless and purposeful. German submarine crews had survived situations like this many times before. They understood the standard pattern of Allied attacks. The procedure was well rehearsed. Descend to maximum operational depth. Maintain absolute silence. Wait for the enemy ships to lose tracking contact in the acoustic shadow directly beneath their hulls. Execute a sharp turn during those critical seconds when the attackers passed overhead and released their explosives. Then endure the violent shockwaves that might shatter instruments and crack light bulbs, but rarely penetrated the reinforced hull at such depths. What Krankenhagen didn't know, what virtually no German commander fully grasped in May 1944, was that the fundamental nature of underwater combat had changed completely. The American destroyer escort Eugene E. Elmore maintained continuous tracking contact with the German submarine despite the depth. Her acoustic detection system could locate submerged vessels at distances approaching 3,000 yards under favorable conditions. And these conditions were nearly ideal. More significantly, mounted on the ship's forward deck sat a weapon that German intelligence had only recently begun documenting. An anti-submarine mortar system that fired ahead of the attacking vessel. Around 9 in the evening, the American commander ordered his first attack. 24 projectiles launched forward in quick succession, firing in less than 2 seconds. Each bomb measured 7 inches across, weighed 65 pounds, and contained 35 pounds of advanced explosive. They arced through the darkness and splashed into the Atlantic in a circular pattern 200 yards ahead of the ship's bow. The projectiles descended at 23.5 feet per second. At the submarine's depth of 600 feet, they would arrive in roughly 30 seconds. Unlike conventional depth charges that exploded at predetermined depths whether they struck anything or not, these weapons only detonated upon direct contact. The first volley missed, sinking silently past the submarine to the ocean floor. Krankenhagen probably thought he'd successfully evaded the attack. The destroyer escort maintained tracking contact. The ship turned for another pass. 3 minutes to reload the launchers. Another 24 projectiles launched. 30 seconds after entering the water, 3 underwater explosions resonated through the destroyer's listening equipment. 3 direct impacts against the pressure hull. 4 minutes later, sonar operators detected a different sound. A heavy, crushing detonation. The submarine had imploded as it sank beyond its collapse depth, killing all 55 men aboard instantly. From the moment the destroyer fired its second salvo to the submarine's destruction took approximately 4.5 minutes. This engagement represented something German submarine commanders were only beginning to comprehend in spring 1944, a technological transformation that eliminated the tactical advantages they'd relied upon since the war began. The question that would haunt surviving German submariners through the conflict's final year was stark and terrible. How do you survive an attack you cannot hear approaching, cannot evade, and that arrives before you can maneuver? To understand the psychological impact of this weapon system on German submarine crews requires understanding what those men believed about their survival chances before this technology appeared. By 1943, German submariners operated under no illusions about the dangers they faced. The Battle of the Atlantic had claimed thousands of their comrades, but they also possessed hard-won tactical knowledge that offered genuine hope for survival. German submarine doctrine, refined through brutal experience since 1939, centered on exploiting the fundamental weakness of Allied anti-submarine warfare, the sonar blind spot. British and American detection systems transmitted sound pulses that bounced off submerged targets and returned as echoes. The technology worked reasonably well at medium ranges, allowing escort vessels to detect submarines and track their movements. But at close range, the physics of underwater sound detection created a critical vulnerability. As an escort vessel closed to attack, the time between the transmitted pulse and returning echo shortened progressively. Eventually, at ranges typically under 200 yards, the outgoing pulse and returning echo merged into what operators called an instantaneous echo. The submarine effectively vanished from detection at precisely the moment when accurate weapon placement mattered most. This blind spot extended directly beneath the attacking ship, creating a zone where the submarine could maneuver undetected. German commanders learned to exploit this weakness with practiced precision. As the escort vessel passed overhead to release depth charges, the submarine would execute sharp changes in direction and speed. The escort, temporarily blind, dropped its charges based on the submarine's last known position, a position that might be 50 or 100 yards from where the submarine actually maneuvered during those critical seconds. Depth charges themselves imposed further limitations that worked in the submarine's favor. Standard depth charges used by Allied forces through 1943 sank at approximately 8 to 9 feet per second. For a submarine at 300 feet depth, not even the maximum diving depth of most submarines, the charges required over 30 seconds to reach attack depth after entering the water. During that half minute, while the escort remained blind and the charges slowly descended, the submarine's captain could order changes in depth, speed, and heading. The explosives in depth charges detonated at preset depths using pressure-sensitive fuses, regardless of whether they were near the target. This created massive underwater explosions that temporarily disrupted sonar performance for both the attacker and any other escorts in the vicinity. The turbulence and noise from these explosions could persist for 15 minutes or longer, during which time the submarine might escape entirely, running silent at a different depth and heading than the escorts expected. German submarine construction emphasized structural strength, specifically to survive depth charge attacks. The pressure hull of a Type 7C submarine, the most common variant, could theoretically withstand pressures at depths approaching 750 feet, though captains rarely pushed their boats to absolute collapse depth limits. More importantly, the hull could absorb substantial shock damage from depth charges exploding nearby without catastrophic failure. Multiple charges had to detonate within 10 to 20 feet of the hull to inflict fatal damage. Statistics validated this relative survivability. British records documented that during the war, out of over 5,000 depth charge attacks, only 85 resulted in confirmed submarine kills, a success ratio of approximately 1 in 60. Many submarines survived hundreds of depth charges during their operational careers. One submarine famously endured 678 depth charges dropped against it in April 1945 before finally escaping. While such extreme cases were exceptional, they reinforced the belief among German submariners that depth charge attacks, however terrifying, were survivable if the crew maintained discipline and the captain executed proper evasive tactics. This is not to suggest German submarine crews felt invulnerable. They understood acutely that Allied anti-submarine capabilities had improved dramatically since the early war years. By 1943, convoy escorts employed increasingly sophisticated tactics. Coordinated group attacks using multiple escort vessels made evasion more difficult. Improved sonar systems with better range and resolution reduced the time submarines could maneuver undetected. The introduction of escort carriers providing air cover over convoys eliminated the surface mobility that German tactics required. May 1943, which German submariners came to call Black May, represented a turning point. In that single month, Allied forces sank 41 submarines, losses that exceeded the rate at which German shipyards could build replacements. The German admiral temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, acknowledging that the balance had shifted. Yet even as the strategic situation deteriorated, individual submarine commanders retained tactical options. Based on their understanding of Allied weapons and detection systems, they could still dive deep, exploit the sonar blind spot, and maneuver during the critical seconds when escorts were dropping depth charges. The psychological framework that sustained German submarine crews through their missions rested on this foundation of tactical knowledge. They accepted that their work was extraordinarily dangerous. By war's end, approximately 28,000 of the 40,000 men who served in submarines would die, a casualty rate exceeding 70%. But danger and certain death were not identical concepts. Skill mattered, experience mattered, understanding your enemy's weapons and their limitations mattered. A competent captain who knew his boat and executed proper tactics could bring his crew home. Many had done so repeatedly. The anti-submarine projector entered service with British escort vessels in 1942, but its impact on German tactical calculations took time to register. Initial deployments produced disappointing results. Success rates of approximately 5% barely exceeded those achieved by depth charges. Royal Navy captains launched attacks so infrequently in early 1943 that the Admiralty issued a directive ordering commanders to report specifically why they had chosen not to use the weapon when engaging submerged contacts, unlike depth charges, which always produced spectacular explosions that might convince crews they had damaged or frightened their target. Misses were discouragingly silent. The projectiles simply sank to the ocean floor without detonating, leaving no evidence of the attack except 24 small splashes in the water. This silence eliminated the psychological satisfaction that depth charge attacks provided even when those attacks failed to sink. The technical principle behind the weapon addressed the fundamental problems that plagued depth charge attacks, but translating that principle into operational success required time, training, and integration with improved sonar systems. The weapon consisted of 24 spigot mortars arranged in 4 rows of 6, mounted on a steel cradle on the forward deck. The spigots were angled so projectiles would land in a circular pattern approximately 130 feet in diameter, about 200 yards ahead of the firing ship's position. Forward firing was the crucial innovation. Unlike depth charges, which had to be dropped from the stern after the attacking ship passed over the target, these projectiles were launched ahead while the submarine remained detectable by sonar. This eliminated the blind time during which submarines could maneuver undetected. The captain could maintain sonar contact throughout the attack, and even adjust course to compensate if the submarine changed position between the moment of firing and the arrival of the projectiles. The contact fuses represented sophisticated engineering that had required extensive development. Each projectile had to survive the violent impact with the water surface without detonating prematurely. Once submerged, a small propeller began spinning in the water flow, arming the fuse after the projectile had descended approximately 50 feet. Upon striking a hard surface, the hull of a submarine, the fuse would trigger the explosive charge instantaneously. The explosive was approximately 50% more powerful than conventional explosives used in earlier depth charges. The rapid sink rate gave submarines almost no time to react. At 23.5 feet per second, projectiles reached 200 feet depth in under 9 seconds. For a submarine at operational depth of 300 feet, the time from water entry to arrival was approximately 13 seconds, compared to the 30-plus seconds required for standard depth charges to reach the same depth. This weapon cut reaction time by more than half. Most significantly, a single direct hit was typically sufficient to sink a submarine. The contact detonation meant no water cushion existed to dissipate the explosive force. 35 pounds of advanced explosive detonating directly against the pressure hull would rupture it catastrophically. Even if the projectile struck the outer casing rather than the pressure hull directly, the explosive force at contact distance usually proved fatal. By late 1943 and into 1944, Allied anti-submarine forces resolved the early problems that had plagued deployment. Better training taught crews how to aim the weapon more effectively. The introduction of combat information centers aboard escort vessels integrated sonar data with fire control systems, allowing more accurate attacks. Most critically, improved sonar systems could maintain contact at closer ranges and greater depths than earlier equipment. Statistics began reflecting these improvements. By the end of the war, attacks achieved success rates of approximately 20%. 1 submarine sunk for every 5 attacks. In comparison, depth charges never achieved better than 1 success in 80 attacks. Out of 268 attacks documented by British forces, 47 resulted in confirmed submarine kills, a ratio dramatically better than conventional depth charging. The United States Navy adopted the weapon through reverse lend-lease in late 1942. American destroyer escorts, specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare, received the system as standard equipment. These vessels, smaller than fleet destroyers but larger than corvettes, proved ideally suited to the weapon system. By 1944, equipped American escorts were operating across the Atlantic and in the Pacific Theater against Japanese submarines. 11 of the last 16 submarine sinkings achieved by U.S. Navy destroyers and destroyer escorts involved these projectiles. 1 American ship sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days during May 1944 using the system almost exclusively, a record that demonstrated the weapon's devastating effectiveness when properly employed by a well-trained crew with good sonar integration. Yet for German submarine commanders, understanding that such a weapon existed was not the same as understanding its implications for their survival. Intelligence reports filtered back through Naval Command describing forward-firing anti-submarine weapons that exploded on contact. But the full tactical picture, how it eliminated the blind spot, the impossibly fast sink rate, the silence of failed attacks that allowed escorts to maintain sonar contact. This knowledge came too slowly to affect German doctrine or training meaningfully. By the time German submarine command fully grasped what they faced, the war had already turned irreversibly against them. The question was no longer whether this weapon would impact German submarine losses, but rather how many more submariners would die before they learned what Captain Krankenhagen discovered in his final moments on May 29, 1944, that all their hard-won tactical knowledge about surviving depth charge attacks meant nothing against a weapon that removed the very assumptions on which that knowledge rested. The development of the weapon system began not in grand naval research laboratories, but in the makeshift offices of an organization whose staff earned an affectionate nickname for their unconventional approach to military engineering. A Royal Navy commander conceived the forward-throwing mortar concept in spring 1940, recognizing that the fundamental problem with depth charges was not their explosive power, but their tactical deployment. The technical challenge proved formidable. Spigot mortar technology had been developed between the wars, a system where the propelling charge remained fixed in the weapon, while a rod fitted inside a tubular tail on the projectile itself. This principle had been successfully adapted for infantry mortars and anti-tank weapons. Adapting it for naval use against submarines required solving problems that had defeated earlier attempts, and earlier, mortar tested aboard a Royal Navy ship in 1941, represented the first attempt at a forward-firing anti-submarine weapon. It failed comprehensively. The projectiles used an iron nose that limited explosive payload. Range was inadequate, accuracy poor, and the explosive charge insufficient to reliably penetrate a submarine's pressure hull, even if it struck directly. The development team redesigned everything. They placed 35 pounds of advanced explosive in each projectile with the contact fuse mounted in the nose rather than the tail. The tubular tail provided stability during flight and descent. Critical experiments determined that projectiles with flat noses were less likely to skip or ricochet when striking the water surface at high velocity, ensuring they would sink vertically into the target area rather than scattering unpredictably. The contact fuse mechanism required extraordinary precision engineering. It had to withstand the violent shock of hitting the water at terminal velocity without premature detonation. Once submerged, a small propeller blade mounted on the nose began rotating in the water flow. After approximately 50 feet of descent, achieved by calibrating the propeller's pitch and resistance, the fuse armed itself. Upon striking a solid surface harder than ocean floor sediment, a mechanical trigger would fire the detonator instantaneously. Determining the optimal explosive charge weight involved research that bordered on espionage. German submarine construction details remained classified, but the development team discovered an Italian naval magazine that had published photographs of German submarine production. One image showed a worker standing on a submarine's pressure hull while performing maintenance work on the outer casing deck. By carefully measuring the worker's apparent leg length in the photograph and calculating perspective distortion, engineers estimated the vertical distance between the pressure hull and outer casing, critical information for determining whether 35 pounds of explosive would penetrate both layers. The pattern of projectile dispersal required mathematical optimization. Using a device that resembled a roulette wheel with a scale model submarine placed at various positions, engineers spent days launching miniature projectiles at the model. They recorded thousands of impacts, analyzing which projectile angles and spacing patterns provided the highest probability of hitting a submarine attempting various evasive maneuvers. The final pattern, 130 feet in diameter with projectiles spaced approximately 18 feet apart, represented the statistical optimum for catching a submarine, even if it maneuvered during the brief seconds between projectile. Launch and water impact. A Royal Navy ship received the prototype launcher in 1941 for sea trials. The weapon performed adequately in testing, but operational results disappointed expectations severely. No submarine kills occurred until November 1942, despite installation aboard 100 ships. Crews reported numerous technical problems. North Atlantic weather frequently covered the launcher with spray and seawater, causing electrical firing circuit failures that resulted in incomplete salvos with some projectiles failing to launch. In heavy seas, maintaining accurate aim proved extraordinarily difficult. The psychological dimension created perhaps the greatest obstacle. Depth charge attacks always produced massive explosions visible from the surface, great geysers of water erupting violently, regardless of whether the charges hit anything. This visual and auditory feedback provided crews with a sense of accomplishment and gave escort commanders confidence they were damaging the enemy, even when intelligence later revealed the submarine escaped undamaged. The new weapon's silence when it missed removed this psychological reinforcement entirely. 24 small splashes, followed by nothing but ocean waves, created a profound sense of futility. Royal Navy leadership responded to the disappointing results with characteristic determination. In early 1943, an officer from the Development Directorate traveled to the base where most Atlantic escort vessels operated. He conducted comprehensive retraining programs ship by ship, explaining the weapon's technical principles, and, more importantly, presenting case studies of successful attacks that demonstrated its lethal effectiveness when properly employed. The training emphasized several critical points that crews had misunderstood. First, the silence of a missed attack was actually a tactical advantage, not a deficiency. Depth charge explosions obscured sonar returns for 15 minutes or longer, forcing escorts to reacquire the submarine from scratch. The new weapon's silence meant continuous sonar tracking throughout multiple attack runs, dramatically increasing the probability that subsequent salvos would strike the target. Second, the circular pattern was designed specifically to account for submarine evasion during the projectile's descent time. Crews needed to aim at where the submarine was at the moment of firing, not attempt to predict its future position. Third, any explosion indicated a direct hit and almost certainly meant a kill, unlike depth charges, which might explode near a submarine without or inflicting fatal damage. Transformation in effectiveness coincided with broader technological improvements in Allied anti-submarine warfare during late 1943 and through 1944. The introduction of combat information centers fundamentally changed how escort vessels processed tactical data and made attack decisions. Previously, the captain commanded from the bridge, while sonar operators worked in a separate compartment, calling out bearing and range information that the captain had to mentally integrate with the ship's heading and speed to determine attack geometry. The Combat Information Center consolidated all tactical information in a single location. Sonar returns appeared on displays that overlaid the ship's position and heading. Radar contacts merged with sonar data, providing a comprehensive tactical picture. Most critically for weapon effectiveness, the fire control system integrated directly with sonar tracking, calculating firing solutions that accounted for the submarine's depth, speed, and heading along with the attack ship's course and the projectile's ballistic trajectory. German submarine commanders began encountering this integrated system without understanding what had changed. One submarine commander led his vessel during a patrol off the American East Coast in May 1945, the final weeks of the European War. British aircraft had attacked his submarine near the surface a year earlier, but he survived and brought his boat home. His second patrol would demonstrate how completely the tactical equation had shifted. On May 5, 1945, the German admiral transmitted orders to all submarines directing them to cease offensive operations. Germany's surrender was imminent. Whether this commander received this transmission or chose to ignore it remains disputed by historians. On May 6th, his submarine torpedoed and sank an American merchant vessel off Rhode Island, the last merchant vessel sunk by German submarine action in American waters. The response was immediate and overwhelming. American destroyer escorts along with several other vessels converged on the attack location. One destroyer made initial sonar contact with the submarine at approximately 8:30 in the evening. The hunt that followed lasted through the night and into the early morning hours of May 7th, but its outcome was never seriously in doubt once the American escorts established contact. At approximately 8:30 that evening, one destroyer dropped 13 magnetic depth charges. One exploded, but the crew could not determine whether it struck the submarine or one of the numerous shipwrecks littering the shallow waters off Rhode Island. The commander, who had succeeded his former captain after the earlier attack, maneuvered his boat through the turbulence. The submarine was detected again at approximately 11:43 that night, 4,000 yards east of its previous position, lying dead in the water with propellers silent at approximately 100 feet depth. The temperature inside would have been rising in the hot, fetid air. Light bulbs shattered by the concussive force of near-miss depth charges. Gauge faces cracked. Small leaks might have appeared in hull fittings stressed by repeated shock. The crew maintained silence, knowing that any noise might betray their position to the hunting escorts above. They had survived attacks before. The commander understood the doctrine: wait for the escorts to lose contact in the blind spot, then maneuver during the critical seconds when depth charges descended. But the escorts maintained perfect sonar contact. At approximately 2 in the morning on May 7th, one destroyer executed an attack run. The projectiles entered the water in their characteristic circular pattern. Most sank silently to the bottom, but 3 struck the submarine's pressure hull directly. The 35-pound explosive charges detonated on contact. What happened next depends on where exactly those 3 projectiles struck. If they penetrated the pressure hull cleanly, the crew died instantly as seawater under tremendous pressure flooded into the submarine's compartments with explosive force. The air pressure inside would have compressed violently, creating temperatures high enough to ignite anything combustible. Death would have come in less than a second for men near the impact points, perhaps slightly longer for those in other compartments, as the ocean claimed the entire vessel. If the projectiles struck the outer casing and ruptured ballast tanks without immediately breaching the pressure hull, the commander and his crew endured a different horror. They would have known immediately that the submarine was mortally damaged. The boat would have begun sinking nose or stern down, depending on which tanks flooded, with the crew powerless to arrest the descent. At 100 feet depth when the attack occurred, they had perhaps 4 minutes before the submarine reached crush depth somewhere beyond 700 feet. 4 minutes of knowing exactly what was coming as the pressure hull groaned under increasing stress. Small leaks becoming jets of water under impossible pressure. The boat tilting at steeper angles as it plummeted into darkness. Then the final moment, a sound described by sonar operators as a heavy crunching explosion as the pressure hull imploded, the entire structure collapsing inward in a fraction of a second under millions of pounds of force. No one aboard survived. All 55 men died. The sinking represented not an isolated incident, but a pattern that had been developing throughout 1944 and into 1945. An operation in April and May 1945 demonstrated the full integration of Allied anti-submarine capabilities against a concentrated German submarine threat. Intelligence indicated that Germany had dispatched a group of submarines toward the American East Coast, possibly armed with advanced weapons. The threat prompted the United States Navy to organize 2 large barrier forces specifically to intercept and destroy these submarines before they could reach American waters. The first barrier force included 20 destroyer escorts divided between northern and southern groups, each supported by an escort carrier. The second barrier force consisted of 2 more escort carriers and 22 destroyer escorts. These forces established patrol lines across the mid-Atlantic, positioned based on intelligence gathered from decrypted German naval communications. The Germans remained unaware that their codes had been comprehensively broken, continuing to transmit detailed operational orders that Allied codebreakers read almost as quickly as the intended German recipients. One submarine became the first casualty. Just before midnight on April 15th, an American destroyer detected the submarine on radar as it attempted to transit the barrier on the surface. The destroyer immediately attacked, but the submarine submerged and initially escaped. Assisted by another destroyer, the first ship regained sonar contact and made 3 additional attacks over the following hours. The third attack at approximately midnight on April 16th sank the submarine with the loss of her entire crew of 56 men 40 minutes later, and only 1.5 nautical miles from that submarine's last position. The second destroyer detected another submarine on radar. This submarine had apparently closed on the destroyer escorts while they prosecuted the first boat. The submarine submerged after being illuminated by searchlight and hit in the conning tower by small caliber fire. Multiple destroyers tracked the submarine with sonar through the remainder of the night. Multiple attacks followed. One destroyer sank the submarine at approximately 4 in the morning, with no survivors from her crew of 52 men. Both submarines suffered massive explosions when struck by projectiles, explosions far larger than 35 pounds of explosive should have produced. This raised fears among American commanders that the submarines were indeed carrying rockets or other advanced weapons, motivating intensified efforts to destroy the remaining submarines before they could approach closer to American territory. Intelligence later determined that neither submarine carried such weapons. The massive secondary explosions likely resulted from the strikes, detonating the submarine's own torpedo warheads or compressed air flasks. 2. More destroyers sank another submarine just before midnight on April 22nd using coordinated attacks. No one from the crew of 55 survived. On April 24th, another destroyer severely damaged a submarine after nearly 10 hours of continuous hunting. The submarine surfaced but sank after the destroyer and 3 other escorts fired on it with deck guns. The captain and 32 crewmen survived and were taken prisoner. Some were harshly treated during interrogation as American. Intelligence officers attempted to determine whether the submarine had been carrying weapons for attacks on American cities. The pattern was unmistakable to those analyzing the results. Submarines that would have survived or escaped from depth charge attacks were being destroyed rapidly once equipped escorts established sonar contact. The weapon eliminated the blind spot that German tactical doctrine depended upon. The rapid sink rate gave submarine commanders no time to execute the evasive maneuvers that had saved submarines from depth charges. The contact fuses meant that any explosion indicated a hit, and hits were almost invariably fatal. For German submarine commanders who survived their encounters and returned to base, the reports they filed painted an increasingly grim picture. The standard evasion tactics, diving deep, going silent, sharp course changes when the escort passed overhead, no longer provided reliable survival margins. Some escorts could maintain sonar contact at depths previously considered safe. Some attacks came from ahead rather than from directly overhead, arriving before the submarine could maneuver. The explosions, when they came, struck directly against the hull rather than detonating nearby and producing damage through shockwaves transmitted through water. German naval intelligence struggled to compile accurate information from these fragmentary reports. They understood that forward-firing anti-submarine weapons existed and that these weapons used contact fuses. But the full tactical picture, how the weapon integrated with improved sonar systems, how the forward-firing eliminated blind time, how the rapid sink rate compressed reaction time to seconds. This comprehensive understanding came too slowly to affect German tactics or training meaningfully. By the time naval analysts fully grasped the implications, Germany's submarine force had been decimated beyond any possibility of recovery. The statistical record tells a story of transformation in anti-submarine warfare that German commanders could read but not counter. During the war, British forces conducted over 5,000 depth charge attacks that resulted in 85 confirmed submarine kills, a success ratio of approximately 1 in 60 attacks. In comparison, the new system achieved 268 attacks resulting in 47 kills, a ratio of approximately 1 in 5.7 attacks. By the final year of the war, that ratio improved further to approximately 1 kill for every 5 attacks, a 20-fold improvement over conventional depth charging. American forces achieved similar results once crews mastered the weapon's employment. 11 of the last 16 submarine sinkings by United States Navy destroyers and destroyer escorts involved these projectiles. The weapon proved equally effective in the Pacific theater against Japanese submarines. One American ship's unprecedented destruction of 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days during May 1944 demonstrated what a well-trained crew with good sonar integration could accomplish. For German submarine crews, the implications were devastating and personal. The casualty rates among submariners, already horrific, worsened through 1944 and into the final months of the war. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in submarines during the war, approximately 28,000 died, a loss rate exceeding 70%. No other branch of any military service in any nation suffered comparable casualties. The introduction of this weapon and other improved anti-submarine technologies contributed significantly to this carnage during the war's final 18 months. Psychological dimension proved equally corrosive. German submarine doctrine had emphasized that skill and tactical knowledge could offset Allied numerical and technological advantages. Experienced commanders who understood their boats and executed proper evasion techniques could survive and complete their missions. This belief system, while never guaranteeing survival, provided a framework that made the work psychologically sustainable. Men could convince themselves that their fate remained partially in their own hands, that competence and courage mattered. The new weapon demolished that framework by removing the tactical variables upon which German doctrine depended. It attacked from ahead while the submarine remained under continuous sonar observation, eliminating the blind spot that evasion tactics exploited. The projectiles arrived in seconds rather than the half-minute or longer that depth charges required, compressing reaction time below the threshold where human decision-making could effectively respond. The contact detonation meant a single hit was fatal, removing the graduated damage model where submarines might survive near misses and accumulate survivable damage over extended attacks. Surviving submarine commanders reported a psychological shift among crews during the final year of the war. The grim determination that had characterized earlier periods gave way to something approaching fatalism. Men understood intellectually that they were likely sailing to their deaths. The operational statistics made this unavoidable. New submarines departing on their first patrol had survival probabilities measured in single-digit percentages. Experienced boats and crews fared only marginally better as Allied anti-submarine capabilities continued improving while German resources and training standards deteriorated. One commander who survived the war described the atmosphere in his memoir, using a title that captured the claustrophobic horror of submarine service during this period. He wrote of men going to sea knowing they would probably not return, of silent meals before departure, where submariners avoided discussing the future because acknowledging it seemed like inviting fate. He described the sounds of depth charge attacks, the waiting in darkness and silence while water dripped from stressed hull fittings, and men counted the seconds between explosions, calculating whether the pattern was moving closer or farther away. But he also noted that attacks which came without warning, no sound of approaching propellers, no gradual intensification of detection pings, were the ones that terrified crews most completely. The submarine might be running silent at depth when suddenly the hull would ring with the impact of projectiles striking directly, followed instantaneously by the catastrophic detonation that meant someone's war had just ended. No time to brace for impact, no opportunity for evasive action, no gradual build-up of tension that at least gave crews the illusion of participation in their own survival. Just sudden violence and death, or for the fortunate few in boats that survived damaged, the knowledge that next time they might not be so lucky. The German submarine force effectively ceased to exist as a strategic threat during the final months of the war. The Admiral continued dispatching boats on patrol, partially because withdrawal would have freed Allied naval resources for other operations, partially from institutional inertia, and partially from the increasingly desperate hope that new submarine designs equipped with breathing apparatus might restore some tactical balance. They did not. The war ended with Germany's submarine bases in France destroyed or captured, her remaining operational boats scattered across Norwegian fjords and Baltic ports, and her crews consisting largely of inadequately trained replacements for the experienced submariners who had died during 4 years of brutal attrition. The story of this weapon system extends beyond its immediate tactical impact on submarine warfare. It represents a case study in how incremental technological improvements, when properly integrated into operational doctrine and supported by adequate training, can fundamentally alter combat dynamics even when the underlying technology is not revolutionary. The weapon was not a guided system or electronic marvel. It was a relatively simple mechanical device, a spigot mortar adapted for naval use, firing unguided projectiles that sank through water and detonated on contact. Yet this straightforward concept, when combined with improved sonar systems and better tactical training, achieved effectiveness that far exceeded more sophisticated weapon systems. The development process also illustrated the importance of persistence in the face of early failure. Initial deployments achieved disappointing results that might have justified abandoning the weapon entirely. Success rates barely exceeded those of depth charges. Crews distrusted the system. Technical problems plagued operations. A less determined organization than the Royal Navy might have concluded the weapon was fundamentally flawed and returned to established methods. Instead, British leadership analyzed the problem systematically, identified that most difficulties stemmed from inadequate training and poor integration with sonar systems rather than inherent design flaws, and invested resources in comprehensive crew education programs that transformed performance. The American adoption through reverse lend-lease demonstrated Allied cooperation in military technology development. Britain, which had spent considerable resources developing the weapon, freely shared the design with American forces. The United States produced its own variants and improvements, including smaller systems for patrol craft that could not accommodate full launches. This collaborative approach, where each ally contributed their strengths to common defense challenges, contrasted sharply with German and Japanese practices where inter-service rivalry and institutional jealousy often prevented effective cooperation. The tactical implications of forward-firing anti-submarine weapons influenced naval doctrine well beyond the war. The principle that weapons should be employed while maintaining sensor contact with the target, rather than after losing contact, became fundamental to modern anti-submarine warfare. Post-war developments, including British mortar systems and eventually acoustic homing torpedoes, all embodied this same concept: maintain contact, fire while the target remains under observation, eliminate the blind time that allows evasion. For German naval theorists reflecting after the war, this weapon represented one element in a comprehensive Allied technological and tactical response that German forces could not counter, given their resource constraints and strategic circumstances. The weapon did not single-handedly defeat the submarine threat. Rather, it formed part of an integrated system that included improved radar for surface detection, high-frequency direction finding for radio intercept, escort carriers providing air cover over convoys, increasingly sophisticated sonar systems, and the comprehensive breaking of German naval codes that allowed Allied forces to route convoys around submarine concentrations or position hunter-killer groups to intercept submarines whose locations and intentions were known in advance. The German admiral who commanded the submarine force spent years after the war analyzing why his submarines had failed to achieve the strategic results he believed possible. He correctly identified Allied code-breaking as a critical factor. German submarines were sailing into traps because their operational orders were being read by the enemy. He noted the impact of escort carriers enclosing the mid-Atlantic air gap, where submarines had previously operated beyond land-based aircraft range. He acknowledged that improved Allied sonar and weapons systems made submarine operations increasingly costly, but he never fully accepted that the fundamental equation had shifted irreversibly against submarines once Allied industrial capacity, technological development, and tactical innovation reached full effectiveness. He continued to believe that different tactics, better training, or improved German submarine designs might have altered outcomes. This represented a common pattern among German military leaders, acknowledging specific Allied advantages while refusing to accept that the cumulative effect of those advantages, combined with Germany's deteriorating strategic position and resource base, made defeat inevitable regardless of tactical adjustments. The human cost of this failure to accept reality manifested in the casualty figures. Submarine crews continued sailing on patrols through the final weeks of the war, when any strategic benefit from their operations had long since evaporated. Submarines that could have remained in port, preserving their crews' lives for Germany's eventual reconstruction, instead departed on missions that achieved nothing beyond adding more names to the casualty lists. The dedication and courage of these men deserves respect, but their sacrifice was wasted by leadership that could not accept what the evidence clearly demonstrated. The German admiral who commanded the submarine force spent years after the war analyzing why his submarines had failed to achieve the strategic results he believed possible. He correctly identified Allied code-breaking as a critical factor. German submarines were sailing into traps because their operational orders were being read by the enemy. He noted the impact of escort carriers enclosing the mid-Atlantic air gap, where submarines had previously operated beyond land-based aircraft range. He acknowledged that improved Allied sonar and weapons systems made submarine operations increasingly costly, but he never fully accepted that the fundamental equation had shifted irreversibly against submarines once Allied industrial capacity, technological development, and tactical innovation reached full effectiveness. He continued to believe that different tactics, better training, or improved German submarine designs might have altered outcomes. This represented a common pattern among German military leaders, acknowledging specific Allied advantages while refusing to accept that the cumulative effect of those advantages, combined with Germany's deteriorating strategic position and resource base, made defeat inevitable regardless of tactical adjustments. The human cost of this failure to accept reality manifested in the casualty figures. Submarine crews continued sailing on patrols through the final weeks of the war, when any strategic benefit from their operations had long since evaporated. Submarines that could have remained in port, preserving their crews' lives for Germany's eventual reconstruction, instead departed on missions that achieved nothing beyond adding more names to the casualty lists. The dedication and courage of these men deserves respect, but their sacrifice was wasted by leadership that could not accept what the evidence clearly demonstrated. The German admiral who commanded the submarine force spent years after the war analyzing why his submarines had failed to achieve the strategic results he believed possible. He correctly identified Allied code-breaking as a critical factor. German submarines were sailing into traps because their operational orders were being read by the enemy. He noted the impact of escort carriers enclosing the mid-Atlantic air gap, where submarines had previously operated beyond land-based aircraft range. He acknowledged that improved Allied sonar and weapons systems made submarine operations increasingly costly, but he never fully accepted that the fundamental equation had shifted irreversibly against submarines once Allied industrial capacity, technological development, and tactical innovation reached full effectiveness. He continued to believe that different tactics, better training, or improved German submarine designs might have altered outcomes. This represented a common pattern among German military leaders, acknowledging specific Allied advantages while refusing to accept that the cumulative effect of those advantages, combined with Germany's deteriorating strategic position and resource base, made defeat inevitable regardless of tactical adjustments. The human cost of this failure to accept reality manifested in the casualty figures. Submarine crews continued sailing on patrols through the final weeks of the war, when any strategic benefit from their operations had long since evaporated. Submarines that could have remained in port, preserving their crews' lives for Germany's eventual reconstruction, instead departed on missions that achieved nothing beyond adding more names to the casualty lists. The dedication and courage of these men deserves respect, but their sacrifice was wasted by leadership that could not accept what the evidence clearly demonstrated. Return now to that moment on May 29, 1944, when the German submarine sank beneath the North Atlantic with all hands lost. Captain Detlev Krankenhagen commanded a modern submarine crewed by trained sailors. He understood anti-submarine warfare tactics that German forces had refined through 4 years of brutal experience. He executed the evasion procedures that doctrine prescribed. Dive deep, go silent, wait for the blind spot, maneuver when the escort passes overhead. Every decision he made was correct according to the knowledge available to him. It was not enough.